Statement, Sudan and Eastern DRC, Foreign Secretary.
Well, with permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll make a statement on the situation in Sudan and Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. The latest conflict in Sudan has now lasted 21 months. This weekend, the Rapid Support Forces attacked the last functional hospital in the besieged city of Al-Fasher in Darfur. The World Health Organization assesses some 70 patients and their families were killed. The attack is far from isolated. In recent weeks, the RSF shelled the Zamzam camp, where displaced people are trapped outside Al-Fasher, while there are disturbing reports of extrajudicial killings by militias aligned to the Sudanese armed forces in Wadamani. The government condemns these attacks in the strongest possible terms. They show callous disregard for international humanitarian law and innocent Sudanese civilians. Exact figures for those killed and displaced in Sudan are hard to come by, but we know aid is being blocked from reaching those in need. And this is without a shadow of doubt one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes of our lifetime. I saw this for myself, Madam Deputy Speaker, last week in Ardre on the Chad-Sudan border. This was the first ever Foreign Secretary to visit Chad. I felt a duty to confront the true horror of what is unfolding, to bear witness and raise up the voices of those suffering, mainly women, so horrendously. 88% of the refugees at the RJ crossing are women and children. I met nurses in a clinic fighting to save the lives of starving children. I met a woman who showed me her scars. She had been burned, she had been beaten, she had been raped. Turning to DRC, conflict has gripped the East for over 30 years. An M23 rebel offensive at the start of this year had already seized Masisi and Minova. This weekend saw them enter Goma, the region's major city, which M23 last occupied in 2012. Brave UN peacekeepers from South Africa, Malawi and Uruguay have tragically been killed. And with hundreds of thousands having already fled M23 to Goma, there is potential for a further humanitarian catastrophe. I have not yet travelled as Foreign Secretary to meet those fleeing Eastern DRC, but the reports speak for themselves. This is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a woman or a girl, with children as young as 9 attacked and mutilated by machete-wielding militias. Around a quarter of the DRC's population are facing acute food insecurity, and frequent bombardment of the makeshift camps which shelter those who have fled their homes. I regret to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Foreign Secretaries updating the House on conflicts in Africa is something of a rarity. As I discussed yesterday with African ambassadors and high commissioners, the surge of global conflict includes the number in Africa almost doubling in the past decade. This is causing untold damage and holding back economic growth, the bedrock of our future partnership with African countries. But where is the outrage? Again and again in Ardre, I was asked, what is the world doing to help us? The truth is, if we were witnessing the horrors of Al-Fasher and Goma on any other continent, or for that matter, seeing the extremist violence in the Sahel and Somalia, anywhere else in the world, there would be far more attention across the Western world. Indeed, one recent survey of armed conflict in 2024 contained spotlights on Europe, Eurasia, Asia and the Americas, but none on Africa. There should be no hierarchy of conflicts, but there is one. Every human life is of equal worth. The impact of these wars, Madam Deputy Speaker, is clear for all to see. You only have to be willing to look. I could not face atrocities like these and shrug my shoulders. However, the House will also recognise the UK's national interest in addressing these conflicts. Irregular migration from Sudan to Britain alone increased by 16% last year. Unscrupulous smuggling gangs are looking to profit from the misery in places such as Sudan and the DRC. And the longer these wars last, the greater their ripple effects. Neighbours like Chad are working hard to manage this crisis alongside others nearby, but further escalation only increases instability and the risks of conflict elsewhere. With Sudan sitting along the major trade routes of the Red Sea and eastern DRC, one of the most resource-rich regions in the world, this is something we cannot tolerate. This government, therefore, refuses to let these conflicts be forgotten. Working with Sierra Leone, the UK prepared a UN Security Council resolution on Sudan to address the humanitarian crisis. Shockingly, despite the support of every other member, including China, Russia wielded their veto. But Russian cynicism will not deter us. We will continue to use our Security Council seat to shine a light on what is happening and work with our African partners on broader UN reform. We have also doubled UK aid to Sudan, supporting over 1 million displaced people. I saw our impact at the RJ crossing and announced a further £20 million to support food production and sexual and reproductive services. The UK is the third largest donor on the crisis, having offered almost £250 million in support this financial year. We've been redoubling our diplomatic efforts as well. In the spring, I'm looking to further gather ministers in the UK to galvanise international support for peace. We need to see three things. First, the RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces committing a permanent ceasefire and the protection of civilians. Second, unrestricted humanitarian access into and within Sudan, and a permanent UN presence. And finally, an international commitment to a sustained and meaningful political process. Instead of new and even more deadly weapons entering the conflict, we want consistent calls for all political parties to unite behind a common vision of a peaceful Sudan. We will engage with all of those willing to work to bring the conflict to an end. On DRC, the UK has also reacted quickly to the current crisis. We now advise British nationals not to travel to the Rubavu district in western Rwanda on the border with Goma. And we are continuing our humanitarian assistance, having provided £62 million this financial year. This enables life-saving assistance such as clean drinking water, treatment for malnourished children, and support for victims of sexual violence. Ultimately, however, we need a political solution. We know that M23 rebels could not have taken Goma without material support from Rwandan Defence Forces. My noble friend, Lord Collins of Highbury, and I have been urging all sides to engage in good faith in African-led processes. Lord Collins spoke to Rwandan and Angolan foreign ministers last week, and in the last few days I've spoken to both Rwandan President Kagame and South African Foreign Minister Lamola. For all the complexities of such a long-running conflict, we must find a way to stop the killing. Madam Deputy Speaker, civilians in Sudan and eastern DRC must feel so powerless. Power seems gripped by those waging war around them. The government, our partners, we cannot simply will a ceasefire into being. But this is not a licence for inaction. As with Gaza, it can take hundreds of days of diplomatic failure to reach even the most fragile of ceasefires. So for our part, Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK will keep doing all it can in our power to focus the world on these conflicts and somehow to bring them to an end. I commend this statement to the House.
Yeah. Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement, and in particular the way in which he's spoken about both Sudan and the DRC. Both conflicts are truly shocking and resulting in an ongoing displacement crisis with millions of innocent people having to flee their homes. As he has highlighted in his statement and from his discussions with the African nations and their diplomats, armed conflict in Africa continues to cause immense human suffering and as well greater pressure on United Nations peacekeeping. The scale of food insecurity is enormous. The most horrific crimes are being committed against civilians. Systematic human rights abuses, sexual violence, torture, and mass civilian casualties. We are deeply concerned by the intensification of fighting in eastern DRC and its humanitarian consequences. We also continue to urge all parties to deliver on their commitments, agreed through the regional peace process. We welcome the mediation efforts facilitated by the Angolan-led Luanda peace process and continue to urge all parties to commit to further political dialogue. In government, my party were committed to the protection of civilians in and around Goma, and the Foreign Secretary will be deeply aware of the long-standing work that took place there, including through the 3-year humanitarian programme for the east of DRC, which sought to deliver life-saving emergency assistance for over 1.1 million people and protect and build resilience of the most vulnerable. Despite all of this, it is important that we learn more and understand what these root causes are and how we can bring greater stability and peace to the DRC. And what is happening in Darfur must also not be tolerated. The conflict in Sudan has put pressure on neighbouring countries already under immense strain and is creating a level of human misery that is totally unconscionable. Our main overreaching objective is clear, and we both agree that we need immediate ceasefire, an end to all these hostilities in Sudan. The UK government, working with international partners, must leave no stone unturned as it tries to press the warring parties into a ceasefire. The government obviously must be doing everything within its power to press the warring parties into that ceasefire and, importantly, hold those responsible for these atrocities to account, because red lines have been crossed in this conflict and we cannot stand by. The Foreign Secretary will know that the Conservative government applied a range of sanctions in the past on those supporting the activities of the Rapid Support Forces and also the Sudanese Armed Forces. As the penholder on Sudan at the United Nations Security Council, can the Foreign Secretary update the House on what actions are likely to follow at the UNSC? The world can and should be doing much more, as the Foreign Secretary has rightly said so. So what recent discussions has he had with other countries who could be doing much more to leverage their own influence? And that also applies within the neighbouring regions too. Can he provide an update on the work of Saudi Arabia and others helping with the important Jeddah process and whether or not that's on track? On sanctions, is he intending to go further, perhaps follow the lead of the of the US sanctions? And did he discuss in his call with Secretary Rubio, because Sudan was not in the readout and was not referenced at all, can he also reference and speak more about the United Nations reform that he has just touched upon and spoken about? The US administration is also reviewing all its aid programmes, so was this discussed in his call with Secretary Rubio? And beyond sanctions, is he working to identify other hard-hitting ways in which putting pressure on the leadership of the RSF and the SAF and those supporting those awful war machines? While this conflict continues to rage on, Madam Deputy Speaker, we also need laser-like focus on the humanitarian assistance, and I don't just mean on the type or the volume, important though that is. If British aid is being sent and getting through, we must ensure that it gets over the border and is distributed to the very people it is intended to help. So can the Foreign Secretary share his latest assessment on the state of the border crossing in Sudan? How much aid is getting through each day and from which crossing points? And when the aid is inside Sudan, are the safeguards there to make sure that it gets to the people that need it? And does he have the mechanisms in place to measure the impact of this? On the subject of aid, this might be premature, but can the Foreign Secretary speak about the government's plan for the future of aid funding, given the spending review that is forthcoming? And while this dreadful war persists, what is he doing now to increase efforts to collect evidence of the crimes committed by those so that those responsible can be accountable and face justice. The Foreign Secretary, Madam Deputy Speaker, has also spoke about in recent days about the vile people smuggling gangs, and he's mentioned that not just in his statement today but also in his written statements previously. Will further comprehensive action be taken to target these miserable and vile, evil criminal gangs? And what more will this government do to put this whole issue to an end and ensure that this destruction and displacement across these two countries will come to an end?
Yeah. Grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, and of course I know that she too draws some heritage from the African continent, and so will take these issues very seriously indeed. And I also know the work of the Right Honourable Gentleman for Saffron Walden, Sutton Coldfield, before coming to office, and he did a lot on the humanitarian aid side, particularly in relation to Sudan. The conflict in Sudan has created, as I said, the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 30 million people, half of Sudan's population, are now in urgent need. And just to make it clear to the House, that's more than Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Gaza and Mali combined. That is how bad the situation currently is. And that is why I did raise this issue with Secretary of State Rubio when I spoke to him yesterday, although because of all the issues in front of us, it was a brief conversation, but we both said we would return to the issue, and we discussed the fact that I am keen to convene a group of nations, including regional partners, on this very same issue. And the truth is, since the conflict of 2023, on the issue of sanctions, the UK has frozen the assets of 9 commercial entities linked to the parties involved in the conflict. We obviously don't talk about what more we might be considering, but it is to say that, of course, we keep that under review. She asks about UN reform, quite rightly, and I'm pleased to see the United States has recently made statements under the last administration, but I'm sure that that's a cross-party position, that Africa should be represented on the UN Security Council. That has been a long-standing view of us over here. And my assessment in relation to the RJ crossing was real concern that the government in Sudan is saying that the crossing should be closed on the 15th of February. We disagree with them. It should remain open. There are real issues about access, and one of the things I'm pressing for with international colleagues is that the UN should be represented. Its agencies and bodies should be able to work unfettered in Sudan, and that civilians must be protected. And recent events at Al Fasher are very worrying indeed in relation to that. But I hope that with regional partners and those internationally engaged, that we can at least come to an agreement that the UN should be present and that civilians, particularly when overwhelmingly they're women and children, should be protected. I did also raise, in fact, the Secretary of State raised with me, when I spoke to him yesterday, this is Secretary of State Rubio, raised with me the position in the DRC and his real concerns. I was clear with President Kagame on Sunday that Rwanda must act to de-escalate this conflict and return to dialogue. I said that an attack on Goma would provoke a strong response from the international community, and my sense, speaking to other nations, is that's what they can expect. Rwanda receives, Madam Deputy Speaker, over $1 billion of aid globally every year, including around 32 million of bilateral UK assistance. All of that is under threat when you attack your neighbours. And in this House, we're really clear. We cannot have countries challenging the territorial integrity of other countries, because just as we see in the continent of Europe, we won't tolerate it. We cannot tolerate it wherever it happens in the world. We've got to be clear about that. The UK has sanctioned M23 and other armed groups through the sanctions and anti-money laundering, There are currently 56 individuals and 9 entities listed under UN sanctions. And again, we keep this under review. And again, she quite rightly talks about the work of the last government in relation to humanitarian assistance, and I put on record the work that they led, indeed, on both sides of this horrendous conflict that is taking place. We're providing 62 million this year for programmes in Eastern DRC. Thank you, members.
Laura Kyrke-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for his updates and for his clear and deeply felt commitment to Sudan. It's the largest humanitarian crisis on record, and yet we're seeing both of the warring parties choking humanitarian access. The Sudanese armed forces have blocked the UN from reaching areas controlled by the Rapid Support Forces, and the RSF are increasingly imposing bureaucratic obstacles to delay and to block aid getting in. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary, what measures is he taking to ensure that both of the warring parties and their international backers are allowing vital aid to get in?
There have been efforts in the past. The US tried to lead efforts, and all regional partners, the Egyptians, the Chadians, whom I all want to see those efforts bear fruit. But the truth is, the people I met are suffering horrendously. And of course, one's always aware when one is at a crossing, meeting those fleeing for their lives, that you're often meeting those closest to the border. You're often meeting those with the means to arrange for smugglers to get them out. And despite the millions that are now displaced and that have left, there are tens of millions more still stuck in Sudan, unable to leave. And so for all of those reasons, we have to be crystal clear about the access issues, not just the fact of aid, but the fact that we want the aid to get through and get to the people that it needs to get to.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Calum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the statement from the Foreign Secretary and thank him for advance sight of it. The Foreign Secretary is right to say that the crisis in Sudan will go down in history as one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes of our lifetimes. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's visit and his personal engagement with this region, and for updating this House on conflicts in Africa. My party agrees with him that our level of concern for those affected by conflict overseas should never be influenced by their location. He's also right to draw the House's attention to the escalation of violence by M23 in Goma. M23's pursuit of mineral resources reminds us of the tragedy for DRC of having such riches that trigger such violence. The announcement of increased UK aid to Sudan in November and the further 20 million deployed at the weekend is welcome. The Foreign Secretary is right to say that the UK's aid budget not only reduces suffering, but also reduces the pressure on refugees to make hazardous journeys to seek sanctuary elsewhere. Yet the UK's ability to respond to humanitarian and conflict situation is reduced by the government's failure to commit to the 0.7 target for ODA. Will the Foreign Secretary explain to the House why it was reported yesterday that £117 million has been cut from the Integrated Security Fund, which would likely mean less money for conflict reduction work? And can he say what assessment he has made of the impact of the Trump administration's instruction that all US aid programmes are suspended? I welcome the Foreign Secretary's plan to convene foreign ministers to galvanise international efforts to seek a ceasefire. Can he say by when this meeting will take place and how he plans to leverage the UK's position as the Security Council penholder on Sudan? Can he confirm the government will not prematurely recognise any alleged authority government in Sudan when the country is so divided? And how does the Foreign Secretary propose to reduce the interference of external powers, including Russia, Iran, UAE and now China, in the conflict?
Foreign Secretary.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and just to say that on the issue of what's happening in Rwanda and the DRC, many, many years ago in this place, go back 22 years, there was an all-party group set up on the Great Lakes, and I was a member of it. The then MP for Bethnal Bean and Bow, Una King, chaired that group for a while, and that was when I first went to the region in the wake of the awful, horrendous ethnic cleansing that we saw in Rwanda and the genocide that we saw in Rwanda back in that period. And that was where I became familiar with the issues. He raises the issue of the 0.7% on development spend, and I understand why those feelings are strongly felt in relation to development, but he knows that we've got a 22 billion black hole. We want to get there eventually, but it will take us some time to get there. But notwithstanding that, the UK still makes a major contribution in development aid spending at a time actually when we are seeing right across the global community aid spending falling because of the cost of living crisis and inflation and the effects that that has on Western populations as well. It's too early to make an assessment of some of the changes that we have read about in the Trump administration. I'm told and advised that there's an 85-day process for the new administration to look at these issues. But as I can say, it was interesting to me that Secretary of State Rubio raised the DRC particularly with me before I raised it with him. We head to the Munich conference in a few weeks' time, where these issues, of course, will be discussed, and I hope that we're able to convene and come together on the issue of Sudan shortly thereafter.
Harpreet, Uppal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement and the work he's doing to shine a light on the crisis. As the Foreign Secretary has said, that this is not just about the amount of aid, but the crucial issue of access. And there is quite clearly unequal access for the UN in distributing aid in Sudan. So can I ask how we're supporting organisations on the ground in Sudan, particularly Sudanese aid organisations, in delivering aid in the area?
Well, I'm very grateful for the question because there is a lively civil society still at work in Sudan. There are NGOs on the ground in Sudan doing what they can in the absence of UN agencies able to do that work. I was very grateful that the World Food Programme facilitated my trip to the Chad border with Sudan. I'm very grateful to see those trucks going in with the World Food Programme emblazoned on them that might bring some alleviation to the suffering. But I have to say, in my conversation with the drivers, they talked about trucks being hijacked, they talked about the dangers, they talked about the barriers of not being able to get as far as they would like. There are still serious issues on the ground.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I thank the Foreign Secretary for his kind remarks. And on Sudan, commend him for going to Chad. He will have seen, when I visited the same location last year, the clear and horrific evidence that this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And while he was there, did he make clear to the President of Chad that the use of his private airport by foreign powers to arm and assist the RSF is completely unacceptable? And on the DRC, as he rightly says, everyone should draw back and engage in the Luanda process. But does he agree that it would help if the Congolese army did not so clearly make common cause with the FDLR, who perpetrated the genocide to which he referred, pose a serious threat to Rwanda's security and were responsible for the murder of nearly 1 million Tutsis in 1992?
Secretary.
Well, let me say to the right honourable gentleman that I had extensive bilateral conversation with the President of Chad, and I spent a very long time because the Foreign Minister accompanied me for most of the 48 hours that I was in Chad. I felt a heartfelt concern for the women and children, recognising, of course, the huge burden that Chad bears with the amount of displaced people that they are harbouring as best they can in their country. And I underline the UK's very clear position on the conflict, the action of the parties and the need for regional partners to support a political process so it can end the bloodshed. And of course, on the situation in DRC, I, of course, have spoken to President Kagame. I also spoke to the Foreign Minister of South Africa following the murder of their peacekeepers. and Lord Collins has spoken to a range of African partners, all of whom have a stake. And of course, the Kenyans and the Angolans have been doing a lot to move forward the Luanda process that I urge Kagame to continue to work on.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. According to UN experts, the UAE has been providing arms and support to the Rapid Support Forces through its networks in Libya, Chad, the Central African Republic, South Sudan and Uganda. These arms and supplies have been reportedly disguised as humanitarian aid, raising serious concerns about the UAE's role in exacerbating conflict and suffering in Sudan. The UAE is one of the UK's largest arms buyers, with billions of pounds worth of defence exports licensed in recent years. So given the gravity of these allegations and the UK's obligations under international law, will the government commit to ending all arms sales to the UAE unless it can be unequivocally verified that they are no longer supplying the RSF?
Well, I say to the honourable gentleman that we hold regular discussions with all... honourable lady, forgive me. I'm still suffering from the jet lag of the plane flight. We hold regular discussions with all regional partners about the conflict in Sudan, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and African partners, as she would expect. Any sustainable process of peace in Sudan requires the support of all of those in the region and beyond.
Stephen Geckins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I firstly thank the Foreign Secretary for coming and making this statement? He was right to say that these devastating conflicts in Africa are often overlooked. So I want to thank him for that, because it's something I know a number of members have mentioned in the past. Can I ask him, will he review the budgets for those who are the conflict budget? Some of the international NGOs are often there when nobody else is and when there's no other attention being paid. On Sudan in particular, Secretary Blinken's remarks around genocide being committed, can he tell us what implications that has for UK foreign policy? And on Rwanda, on DRC, he mentioned the material support from Rwanda. What action is he taking in terms of all of those who have facilitated the conflict, and what action and changes in policy will we see from the FCDO?
Foreign Secretary.
On the first point, let me be absolutely clear that we have come in as a new government. We do think there's an important role for conflict mediation, building, of course, on the historic role that this country has played, including, of course, in Northern Ireland. We've got real strengths. We want to work with partners like Norway and others on conflict. I want to reassure him of that. On the broader regional issues, of course I recognise that there are regional issues. That's why I want to convene. The UK will continue to play its role. It's why we brought the UN resolution with Sierra Leone. It's why I've been trying to rally support globally. And frankly, it's why I visited, taking the opportunity of a ceasefire in Gaza to draw attention to this issue and galvanise the world.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to welcome the Foreign Secretary's visit to a malnutrition clinic on the border of Chad and Sudan, and the additional funding for the region. Sudan does have one of the highest rates of malnutrition in the world. I wonder whether he's discussed his discussions recently with regional actors. Can you go further and give us an update on where those discussions with the regional actors are, what process is underway, and can he give further detail on his assessment of how the aid is currently getting in across the RJ border, especially with ready-to-use nutrition food, which is really, really vital in stopping the malnutrition and the starvation that's happening, especially with children. Thank you.
Secretary.
The experience of visiting with Médecins Frontières, a small clinic in Chad with malnourished children and their mothers, babies, and frankly, knowing that I was making a ministerial trip, but also not knowing whether these small babies would survive in the days ahead, were heartrending. And I thank Médecins Frontières for all that they are doing to keep those children alive and to support those mothers. And that's why we are doubling our aid, not just to Sudan, but also increasing our aid to Chad next door, bearing the brunt of all of those displaced people that have come, and he raises the issue of how we are continuing to work on this issue with other partners. I also chaired a Sudan session during the G7, plus the Arab Quint of foreign ministers, to discuss collective action and how the G7 and the Quint could take the warring parties and push for improved humanitarian access, the protection of civilians, and increase aid. I will continue to redouble my efforts in that regard.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
The Foreign Secretary is right to come here to express his dismay and frustration, which we all share. But what assessment has he made of the effectiveness of the United Nations in this? Because it seems that their mission is failing, and even the resolution that he put together with Sierra Leone, which was in measured and balanced terms, failed to get through on the 18th of November. Would it not be better to look instead at underscoring the importance of an African solution to this? And in that respect, what discussion has he had with the African Union, notwithstanding that it's crucial that currently suspended members are involved in the process?
Foreign Secretary.
He's right to raise the important role of the United Nations. I was hugely disappointed that Russia continues to block progress on the UN Security Council. I have to say that I believe, notwithstanding the pressures, I applaud the work of the United Nations agencies particularly and what they're attempting to do, and I remind him of the work of the World Food Programme, OCHA and others. I do believe that it's important that there's a UN presence in Sudan, that their agencies are able to work unfettered in Sudan, and clearly in the DRC, the fact that UNESCO have pledged to withdraw is a real issue, given what is happening, and therefore what could flow as a result of them ending their period in the country, despite the pressures over the last 20 years.
Dr. Lauren Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement on this. An article in The Lancet in January 2025 this month even, illustrates an alarming rise of multiple life-threatening infectious diseases such as cholera, dengue fever, malaria, measles, polio, and due to the destruction of health and sanitation infrastructures. How is the UK supporting progress in securing humanitarian access to life-saving treatments for these diseases such as malaria? And does he agree with me that this support is needed as these infections have an impact worldwide, as if we allow these infections to fester, they will also have implications for humanity?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I thank her for the work that she is doing now from the backbenches to raise these very same issues. There has been a very worrying outbreak of dengue fever, particularly, and I met individuals who suffered as a consequence of that, and malaria is rife. We will do all we can to support that work, but the aid access issues in Sudan particularly make this extremely difficult. That is why we must have a process that allows for unfettered aid to reach those in Sudan that need it.
Holly Glover.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I join other members of the House in thanking the Foreign Secretary for bringing this statement to the House, given it's so rarely discussed? The United States has often played such a key role historically in ending such conflicts or providing humanitarian support. To support his efforts with Secretary of State Rubio, will the Foreign Secretary be asking for the Prime Minister's support to make sure this is on President Trump's agenda, given the latter stated America First agenda?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I listened to the Secretary of State Rubio's first press conference, and he talked about wanting prosperity for the United States, wanting, of course, security for the United States, and wanting safety for the United States. And the truth is, the tremendous problems that we're seeing in the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and Sudan are deeply worrying, not just for us here in Europe, but also for the United States, because failed countries become a haven of jihadist, extremist activity that washes back up on our shores. That is the truth of it. And when big countries, or indeed more powerful countries, invade small countries, particularly countries with minimal resources, we should be very concerned indeed and raise it as a big issue. So for all of those reasons, I expect the United States will take a big interest in what's happening in this regard.
Madam Jogi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary for his statement and the Shadow Foreign Secretary for her response to it. It's important that we in this House speak with one voice on these issues. Madam Deputy Speaker, in recent days I've heard from a number of my constituents in Newcastle and Lyme with family in Sudan, and to describe them as terrified and devastated doesn't describe it. There's very real fear and anguish in the Sudanese diaspora in the United Kingdom. Now, we have to be seen to be believed, so I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for making his visit to Chad early this week and thank him for his leadership on these issues. But I'd like to reiterate the point mentioned by the member for Wiltshire across the way there. Can he touch on the specific discussions he's had with the African Union in recent weeks? They have an important role to play here. And does he plan to go to Addis to make that case in person?
Foreign Secretary.
Let me be clear, and I should have met this point. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for continuing to raise these issues from the backbenches and pressing me whenever he sees me in the lobby on them. Of course, we are working with the African Union. There is new leadership about to take up post in the African Union over the coming weeks, and we will continue to push these issues with them. We will work with a range of partners. These include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, the United States, African and European countries who are taking an interest, IGAD, the United Nations and the African Union, and I want to reassure him of that.
Shaukat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I also would like to thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement, for indeed Sudan is the forgotten conflict, despite 8 million internally displaced people, 24.5 million people on the verge of a famine as well. And I'd also like to lend my sentiments and honour the 3 United Nations peacekeepers from Uruguay, South Africa and the country of my birth, Malawi. I would like to ask the Minister, in his statement he mentions about more deadly weapons entering the conflict. Who is providing these arms and weapons into Sudan? What vested interest do they have in Sudan? Is it its natural resources of gold, its port? And what leverage are we playing with those countries that we have good diplomatic relations that may be supplying these weapons?
Well, let me say to the honourable gentleman, I met with African ambassadors yesterday to discuss these very same issues. And we did talk about the security and resilience of the African continent and their concerns that after a relatively peaceful period where most of the discussion was about development, if you went back a decade or so, now there's a concern about those who are fighting proxy wars in different ways. This is not to say that, of course, regional powers will not have different interests. But it is to say, when you see the behaviour of mercenaries, when you look at the problems of arms sales in Africa and the damage that it does to civilian life, we have to hold out for a political solution. We have to get back to dialogue. We have to get back to diplomacy. That is what I'm seeking to emphasise in this statement.
Lammy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And again, I want to echo everyone's comments in terms of praising the Foreign Secretary for his visit last week. It's really important we continue to keep that spotlight on Sudan. Last week, I was able to visit an exhibition called Children's Drawing, led by Waging Peace, hosted by my friend, the Honourable Member for Kensington and Bayswater. And they had a series of pictures painted by young children, powerful images of child survivors of the genocides. One of the pictures showed 2 army men fighting and attacking a village and a hut, an attack from the Janjaweed militia. And inside the hut, at the bottom of the drawing, was a soldier raping a woman. And the 80-page book details the resilience of those survivors, but yet also the trauma that those young children have gone through. It's good to see cross-party support in the Chamber today speaking on this really important issue, but this Foreign Secretary is right. Where is the outrage? Where is the constant media coverage on what's going on? There should be no hierarchy in terms of conflicts. Every life is equal. So will the Foreign Secretary give his commitment to the House that he will stand by the victims in Sudan for as long as it takes to get that stability there?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, thank you, I say to my honourable friend for her work in pressing these issues. And I repeat again, where is the Liberal outrage? Where are the marches? Where are the emails flooding MPs' inboxes? Where are they? They're nowhere to be seen. Just a few years ago, the world rallied because of what it saw as horrendous in Darfur. It's unbelievable that a few years later, the world seems to have forgotten. So this is the moment to step up. And I say, with all seriousness, this House has come together this week as we remember those who were massacred in genocide during the Holocaust. These are very serious issues. And just as we've called out horrendous acts against humanity in the past, we must call it out when we see it in our wake today.
Maladenia.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As an MP representing a Sudanese community in Bristol and as a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sudan and South Sudan, I really thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and his real care and concern for the innocent civilians in Sudan and the DRC and the need to protect them from the horrors taking place. His statement says that irregular migration from Sudan to Britain has increased 16% in the last year. Indeed, they were among the top nationalities to cross the Channel in 2024. So does he agree that a key part of our response alongside support on the ground must be to ensure safe and legal routes for Sudanese refugees to come here, and has he raised this with the Home Secretary?
Well, let me say that Sudan was number 2 in the list of those coming in the month of December. So we are seeing this uptick. It's why we continue to work upstream. I hope to be in the continent of Africa looking at more work upstream very, very shortly. And of course, we work with the UN agencies, have been in touch with them over the course of the last few days, and those NGOs that work with refugees to discuss these very same issues.
Absana Begum.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ongoing conflict in Sudan has displaced over 10 million people, caused widespread famine, fueling human rights abuses, including sexual violence, with women and girls disproportionately impacted. Can the Foreign Secretary outline what diplomatic efforts the government are making to ensure all parties are held accountable and adhere to international law and international human rights standards? And he mentioned that the government does not want new and even more deadly weapons entering the conflict. So will he ensure that this House receives full and up-to-date information about UK export arms licences with any government that is alleged to be propping up the RSF or any other military force in this conflict?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for continuing to press these issues. I want to reassure her that the UK continues to pursue all diplomatic avenues to press the parties into a permanent ceasefire, into allowing unrestricted humanitarian access, protecting civilians, and committing to a sustained, meaningful, peaceful process. I also want to reassure her that we have the most robust export licensing regime in the world. And of course, where there are breaches of international humanitarian law, we do suspend licences. We take that very, very seriously, and she should be reassured.
Robin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and could I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement, and in particular agree with his point about the way in which the global media values pay no attention whatsoever to conflict or life in Africa, and he's drawn attention to that today, and I thank him for that. Could I also say that as one who represents a constituency that includes people from both the DRC and Sudan, the communities I represent are emailing, they are talking, and all of them say the same thing. Why is nobody discussing what's going on in the DRC or Sudan? So 2 quick questions for the Secretary of State. 1, what can he do to reduce the flow of arms into Sudan, which are motivated by those countries that want to get hold of the wealth and the natural resources of Sudan and pay no concern whatsoever for the lives of the people in that country? And secondly, having been to Goma on a number of occasions myself in the past, and to other parts of the DRC, I'm very well aware of the long-term conflict that's gone on, essentially over minerals, where militias are financed effectively by mineral companies in order to drag out coltan and other riches from the Congo at the expense of the lives of the people there. And the role of the Rwanda government in supporting M23 and now the occupation of Goma has to be called out and has to be challenged, because surely the future has to be one of peace and has to be one of a democratic engagement of all of the people of the DRC on their future.
Well, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and I know that he has been working. Indeed, he did a lot of work with my predecessor in Tottenham on these issues to do with the African continent. He has been raising these issues consistently for well over 3 or 4 decades, and we're very grateful to that. Can I reassure him that when I say that we want to convene and come together with regional partners, with neighbouring partners to Sudan, and indeed with international partners that take a big interest and play a big role as the UN penholder, we are aware, of course, of some of the motivations. There is gold, for example, in Sudan, but we urge everyone to step back and get to a ceasefire. And this cannot go on forever. There has to be a ceasefire. We need the ceasefire now because of the women and children that are suffering. And like him, I've been to Goma. We've been talking about the coltan in our mobile phones for many years. That is why there are so many external actors engaged in the DRC.
If questions and answers are short, I can squeeze in just a couple more members. Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary spoke movingly about his visit to the Chad-Sudan border, and I commend him for bearing witness. There is no substitute for doing that. Since April 2023 in Sudan, there has been over 500 attacks on healthcare facilities and over 100 healthcare workers have been killed. He will know that attacks on hospitals and healthcare are a growing and grotesque phenomenon across the world. Does he think that we could use our position on the UN Security Council as the lead on protection of civilians to bring countries together and try to drive forward action to protect healthcare and health facilities across the world?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend raises an important issue. We cannot live in a world where the rules are disregarded and aid workers and peace workers are just murdered as they go about their business. And this has been the most horrendous period for loss of life of good people doing good work. And so I will take up a renewed effort using our position on the UN to marshal that.
Gregory Campbell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the horrendous situation in Sudan, as the Foreign Secretary quite rightly said, calls for a common vision for a peaceful Sudan. Would he outline what detailed talks he has had with other nations outside of Russia and the UN, whereby that vision of a peaceful Sudan can be realised more quickly than otherwise would be the case?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, let me reassure him I've spoken to North African countries about this issue. Obviously, I was in Chad, but in Egypt I raised this issue and indeed met with Sudanese refugees in Egypt. I talked about the Quint and the G7, all of those mechanisms we are using, all of those multilateral mechanisms to raise this issue and galvanise further support. It was deeply worrying that when the UN called for donors last year, it got just 50% of the money that's required.
Final question, Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement. Gender-based violence increased by 300% in the DRC in recent years, 2/3 of those in the 3 eastern provinces. In Sudan, we've heard of the epidemic of sexual violence and conflict. This year marks 25 years since the agreement of the landmark resolution on women, peace and security 1325. Yet across the world we are letting women down. So please can the Foreign Secretary outline on the broader agenda how we will make this year the year that we do actually protect women's rights in conflict and ensure their voices are heard?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful for this to be the last question. One of the reasons why the world isn't paying attention to these crises is because it's in the continent of Africa. The second reason I fear is gendered. It is women who are suffering. It's men who are doing the fighting, and it's women who are being left behind. We cannot go backwards And for all of those reasons, I would urge parliamentarians to put down debates, to raise these issues with other colleagues they meet in other parliamentary and democracy systems, so that we do get attention back to these women and children in both of these conflicts and across so many others who are suffering horrendously.
Thank the France. Marvellous, 3 points of order there. I was just going to say that we've got through quite a bit of questions, but we do have to get on with business.